new campaign spending law. As the candidates collect more money from private contributors, they'll get more matching federal checks. Today, President Ford's check was for $374,000. Ronald Reagan got $100,000, as did each of 7 Democrats. Another Democrat, Lloyd Bentsen, got more than any other candidate, $429,000. Terry Sanford got $214,000. We've learned something interesting in an NBC News poll of 48 of the 50 state Republican Party chairmen. 70% of them favored Gerald Ford as their party's presidential nominee, while only 16% want Ronald Reagan. If the president and Reagan are not far apart, as far as the public is concerned, Mr. Ford has an overwhelming lead among his party's professionals. That was their view when we made this survey just before Christmas. Our latest national sampling of 2,800 people was made the second week in December, and that will provide the basis for a special program we're putting on this Sunday afternoon called What America Thinks. We found that 51% of those polled give President Ford a good job rating, and that 43% gave him low marks. But he's doing better than the Congress. Our sample shows only 32% of those polled giving the Congress good marks, while a sizable 56% do not think the Congress is doing a good job. In a month and a half, the year's first presidential primary will be held in New Hampshire, and Reagan is challenging President Ford. And on the day of his arrival, Reagan ran into criticism from 2 of Mr. Ford's New Hampshire supporters, the leaders of the state Senate and the House. They called on Reagan to explain his plan for a $90 billion reduction in federal social welfare programs, including food stamps and Medicaid. If enacted, the plan could result in a tax increase in some states. In New Hampshire, that's bad politics. And Reagan's $90 billion plan could become a national issue. Here's how he explains it in speeches.
Transfer of authority in whole or part in all of these areas would reduce the outlay of the federal government by more than $90 billion using the spending levels of fiscal 1976. With such a savings, it would be possible to balance the federal budget, to make an initial $5 billion payment on the national debt, and cut the federal personal income tax burden of every American by an average of 23%. Government is not the solution. Government is the problem. What I propose to you is nothing less than a systematic transfer of authority and resources to the states.
Today in New Hampshire, Reagan said this systematic transfer would not be a $90 billion budget cut. It is, he said, a transfer of functions that no longer belong at the federal government level and never belonged there in the first place. And Reagan added, "The people of New Hampshire, I understand, are worried that I have some devious plot to impose the sales or income tax on them. I have no such intention." Whether or not the $90 billion plan becomes an issue, Reagan is running and will be defending his political record, which includes 2 terms as governor of California. Frank Burkholzer of our staff has a report on the Reagan record.
Hollywood in 1945 was not just tinsel and glamour. It was also a battleground of labor unions. There were picket lines. There was blood and charges of communist influence. One anti-communist activist was the head of the Actors Union, Ronald Reagan.
We have exposed their lies when we came across them. We have opposed their propaganda. And I can certainly testify in the case of the Screen Actors Guild that we have been eminently successful in preventing them from their usual tactic of trying to run a majority of an organization with a well-organized minority. We have kept them.
That strike is what turned an actor into a politician who became governor 10 years later. He campaigned against the mess, as he put it, of student activism on California campuses. Within weeks of his inauguration, the president of the university, Clark Kerr, had been fired. When anti-war violence escalated, Reagan cracked down. At one point he said, "If it takes a bloodbath, then let's get it over with." When it was over with, there was one lasting change. University education had been tuition-free for California's sons and daughters before Reagan. Reagan made them pay. That was part of his governing philosophy, to squeeze, cut, and trim the state's operations in general and to balance its budget in particular. There was a brief period when he had a majority in the legislature. The Democrats delivered his budget in a gift box as a gag. But he never really had a political honeymoon.
If I'm on a honeymoon, I'm sleeping alone.
On many matters, Reagan's record is complex. He approved mild gun control legislation, a radically liberal divorce law, and an anti-school bus law that was declared unconstitutional. He takes credit for rescuing the state's grandiose water supply system from bankruptcy, but his critics say his Public Utilities Commission soaked the consumers with rate increases. He pioneered with environmental impact statements on all state projects, approved the nation's toughest air and water quality control measures, but was criticized for lax enforcement of industrial safety. On major questions, Reagan created special task forces, and in his second term, he finally learned to negotiate with his legislature instead of just fighting it. The major result was reform of what he called the welfare monster, legislation that tightened welfare eligibility, plugged loopholes. His apparent success impressed many politicians, including President Nixon. Looking back, we can see his reform did streamline and clean up welfare operations. It did not fundamentally change welfare. It did help reduce the welfare caseload by nearly 400,000, but much of that would have happened anyway because of economic prosperity in 1971 and 72. The ideological jewel of the welfare reform, to employ the employables, never really worked. Reagan did not slay the welfare monster, but he did leave his mark on it. He also tried to veto the budget of the flamboyant government-financed poverty lawyers who had fought him at every turn. But a fact-finding panel found his charges against the lawyers irresponsible and without foundation. His most ambitious project was a referendum on taxes. He had put through a $1 billion a year program of property tax relief, but he wanted to permanently reduce the size and authority of government by permanently limiting taxes to a fixed % of total state personal income. In a bitter campaign, that ballot proposition lost. Reagan said because people didn't properly understand it. Ronald Reagan had to learn to work with a basically hostile legislature. He did, and that's part of the record. He squeezed, cut, and trimmed, but caught in rampant inflation, his budgets increased from $4.6 billion at the start to $10.2 billion at the end. He did inherit a sizable deficit from his predecessor. He did turn over to his successor a budget surplus and a payroll of state workers not a whole lot larger than he had at the start. It is also part of his record that his Democratic successor in Sacramento seems to be running the state in many ways much as Reagan did. An unexpected tribute to the ex-union activist, to the ex-actor. Frank Burkholzer, NBC News, Los Angeles.
Birch Bayh, Fred Harris, and Morris Udall were in Iowa. Delegate selection begins there on the 19th of January. Senator Henry Jackson was in Boston. He called President Ford a nice guy who is simply not effective. Terry Sanford was in Concord, New Hampshire, predicting a hard campaign. Those were the Democrats. There was one Republican out today, Ronald Reagan. He was on the second day of a bus tour of New Hampshire's White Mountains. Rick Davis was with him.
Today, Ronald Reagan's run for the votes of the people of New Hampshire began on the ski slopes. It is a Meet the People campaign, being seen, shaking as many hands as possible.
I guess you took up skiing when you were a child, huh?
Part of this campaign trip in New Hampshire seems to be an attempt to disprove the contention that Ronald Reagan doesn't like to campaign hard. He'll be making 30 stops in about 48 hours in New Hampshire. In stop after stop, Reagan has been asked about taxes. Would his reported call for a $90 billion cut in the federal budget mean higher taxes on the local level? Reagan says what he is calling for is a transfer of some programs to the local and state governments, including welfare and education.
In any instance, the people at the local and state level would be able to make the decision, number one, as to whether they wanted to continue the programs. And I'm quite sure that a number of federal programs would be dropped if the states had their way about it because they're serving no useful purpose. Others would be administered, but administered better and more economically. But the manner of financing is not a case that we're recommending suddenly dumping on local government a burden of taxation they do not now carry.
Leaders of President Ford's campaign say the Reagan plan would mean higher taxes in New Hampshire. Reagan denies that, saying tax dollars now going to the federal government would go to state and local governments. At another stop, Reagan was asked about his stand on abortion.
I probably did more soul searching and more study than I've ever done on anything in my life. And I have come to the conclusion that the interrupting of a pregnancy is the taking of a human life.
Ronald Reagan's theme of self-reliance seems to have hit a responsive chord in New Hampshire. He has been warmly received in the cold the first 2 days here. It's a well-organized campaign, operating on a tight schedule. Reagan and his staff are exuding confidence. Rick Davis, NBC News, Berlin, New Hampshire.
In Boston today, Sergeant Shriver, one of the Democratic presidential hopefuls, released an outline of his economic policy, which he said would reduce both inflation and unemployment by the middle of 1978. At the same time, Boston Congressman Thomas P. Tip O'Neill, who was formerly a big booster of Senator Edward Kennedy for president, gave his endorsement to Arizona Congressman Morris Udall. There's no question that Shriver, who is a Kennedy family in-law, would have welcomed O'Neill's support. But today, as Shriver gave out his economic plan in Boston, O'Neill endorsed Udall. For those who intend to get unduly excited at the prospect of all these primaries in a presidential year, David Brinkley's journal this evening contains some cautions and a recipe for keeping calm. David?
The first primary is about 6 weeks away. A dozen or so presidential candidates are already into their working clothes. And for 10 months, the American people will see an endless competition for their attention, support, money, and votes. It is about like having 12 encyclopedia salesmen at the front door all at once. Those who would like to remain calm and collected might bear in mind a few more or less comforting facts. One is that the main subject of argument in a campaign seldom, if ever, has anything to do with what happens when the election is over. For example, in recent presidential campaigns, there was one with a big debate about two islands called Quemoy and Matsu. Whatever happened to Quemoy and Matsu? Nothing. In another campaign, every candidate pinned on a sheriff's badge and talked of law and order. The crime is increased, but nothing else has happened. In the last campaign, the big issue was tax reform. The only reform has been to make Form 1040 even more complex. In this one, so far, Ronald Reagan has got a little argument going about cutting federal spending by $90 billion. Well, no president can make a cut like that. Only Congress could. But on its recent performance, Congress can be expected not to cut the spending, but to raise it. In about 30 primaries this year, it will take several of them, going into April maybe, before it can be seen who can get votes and who can't. As for the first one, New Hampshire, it may be recalled that 4 years ago, Muskie won the primary, only to lose the Democratic nomination to McGovern, who then lost the election to Nixon. John?
Early primary states. Fred Francis reports from Florida. Bob Jameson from New Hampshire.
If there is a Ford machine or a Reagan machine ready to steamroll through the snowy villages and mill towns of New Hampshire, they are still secret weapons. President Ford has been endorsed by most, but not all, of the state's GOP establishment. Legislative leaders in the State House have backed him and have tried to make an issue of Reagan's plan to cut the federal budget by $90 billion and turn programs back to the states. They are saying that will cause new taxes for low-tax New Hampshire. But Reagan has some backing of his own. When he arrived in New Hampshire last week, Republican Governor Meldrum Thompson, a Reagan man, was on hand. And so too was Hugh Gregg, a moderate Republican and former governor whose decision to head Reagan's campaign here was a major victory. And Reagan is backed by the publisher of New Hampshire's only statewide newspaper, the Manchester Union Leader. The publisher is arch-conservative William Loeb, who has called President Ford Jerry the Jerk in front-page editorials that in the past have attacked everyone from Edmund Muskie to Betty Ford. President Ford's campaign, which works out of a Concord storefront shared with H&R Block, the income tax people, began slowly last fall. For a while, it seemed in trouble. But leaders here and in Washington say hard work has corrected all that. Reagan's campaign headquarters, set up in a motel, is to outward appearances a small effort. There are only 5 full-time people on the staff, but they are backed by a slick telephone and direct mail campaign and media events like last week's Reagan visit. No one is talking about overwhelming victory, perhaps because they are trying to avoid setting a target that, when missed in 1972, knocked Edmund Muskie out of the race, and in 1968 helped eliminate Lyndon Johnson. And perhaps neither camp is talking about overwhelming victory because neither camp expects it. Bob Jameson, NBC News, Manchester, New Hampshire.
This is where I'm calling from the Ronald Reagan headquarters on Floral Way.
In Florida, Reagan campaign workers are promoting their candidate by telephone. They hope to make phone pitches to half of Florida's 1 million Republicans before the primary. They're trying to call 15,000 Republicans a day from their 14 campaign offices. The Ford organization says it has opened 7 campaign offices like this one in Cocoa Beach. And the Ford strategy to reach the voter is entirely different. Ford volunteers will rely on a door-to-door handshaking campaign. But the Ford organization is moving slowly, and the door-to-door campaign will not begin for 2 more weeks. Tommy Thomas, a folksy car dealer from North Florida, is Reagan's chief organizer for the primary. He has broad political experience and predicts the telephone campaign will help produce a 2-to-1 victory for Reagan. The Ford organization revolves around Florida Congressman Lou Fry, who's stumping the state as though he were the candidate. He's selling the president as a good man busy doing a good job. Fry says telephones are too impersonal to get that message across.
Well, it's nice to talk about going door to door and then seeing 1 million people, but I can predict right now that they won't do anything like that. They won't get anywhere near it. But I can tell you for sure that we're going to call 1 million Republicans.
If you get a phone call, number one, you're probably not going to be as interested. You're not looking somebody in the eye. It's probably not a personal kind of thing, and you might not even say exactly what you feel to get the guy off the phone. The ball game may be on, the suit may be burning or something like that, so you just say anything to get them off.
The last couple of years have been tough. They've been tough in a lot
of... The fact that the president is letting others do his campaigning here has some Republican leaders worried.
Basic thing of
Ford plans to spend only 3 days in Florida before the primary. Reagan has 16 days of campaigning scheduled here, and with the race now considered a toss-up by many outside the 2 camps, there's a feeling that the personal appearances of Ronald Reagan could make the difference. Fred Francis, NBC News, Miami.
President Ford and Ronald Reagan met in Chicago today with most of the Republican state chairmen. They managed to plug their candidates and still appeal for party unity. Mike Jackson has that story.
Most of the Republican chairmen refused to take sides publicly in the Reagan-Ford contest. And at today's meeting, the National Party chairman encouraged them to present a united Republican front to prevent the primary battles this spring from dividing the party in November.
It's the obligation, it's the responsibility of the campaign committees to seek a nomination for their candidate. It's our responsibility to elect Republicans in November, and we go forward on that basis. I don't see it as being a divisive, bloodletting kind of thing at all, and I hope we can keep it in that perspective.
Ronald Reagan's campaign manager John Sears emphasized party unity in an appeal for support from the state chairman.
If we can go to the election campaign in united fashion and present the American people with the kinds of alternatives that they seem to want, that we can pull ourselves up from the downtrend that we've been having as a party over the last few years and back into a position where we can again dream of making this the majority party of our country.
And President Ford's campaign director, Howard Bo Calloway, reminded the chairman of the president's contributions to the party.
I remind you that campaigning he did last fall was not for himself, that he raised $6 million for the people of you in this room. And because of that, though it has hurt him, it has certainly made a much stronger Republican Party, and I'm grateful for that, too.
The appeals by the Reagan and Ford managers were aimed at creating goodwill with the state chairman. But the warning was clear that the Republican Party, already in the minority, cannot afford a split this election year. Mike Jackson, NBC News, Chicago.
We have another in our series of political profiles tonight, Senator Hubert Horatio Humphrey. He's never made a secret about the fact that he would like to be president of the United States, and right now he's the leader in most of the polls on Democratic candidates. Although Humphrey says he is not running and he does not expect to enter any of the Democratic primaries. The closest Humphrey ever got to the office of president was as Lyndon Johnson's vice president. Tom Pettit has the Humphrey profile tonight.
This is Hubert Humphrey, the classic New Deal Democrat. This is Hubert Humphrey at a small political rally in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Thank you very much. You're a lot of supporter. Thank you.
Everybody's very
thank you. How are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you.
How are you?
The irrepressible Hubert Humphrey has been part of the American political scene for 3 decades. He personifies the old-style politician.
In January 1977, there will be a Democrat in the White House. I really believe that's going to happen.
Without even running, the polls say he is the front runner among Democrats.
But friends, take it easy now.
Hubert and Muriel Humphrey go back a long way to a lot of political campaigns for the Senate and for the presidency. Now Hubert has the fever again, and the enormous energy which the U.S. Senate chamber can hardly contain. Here is a quick illustrated biography of Hubert Horatio Humphrey. He was elected mayor of Minneapolis in 1945 and first made his mark as civil rights advocate. 1948, he was elected to the U.S. Senate and became a prolific sponsor of important legislation. Creation of the Peace Corps, establishing the Job Corps and the Food for Peace program, and much more. 1960, he sought the Democratic presidential nomination and lost to John F. Kennedy. 1964, picked by LBJ as his vice president, walked into trouble over his support of the Vietnam War. Trouble which haunted him in 1968 when he barely lost to Richard Nixon, putting Humphrey out of office for the first time in years. He served for a time as a university professor and public speaker, but in 1970 he was elected again to the U.S. Senate. In 72, he lost a bitterly contested race for the Democratic presidential nomination to George McGovern. Today, he is not running, but would be available for the nomination. If he is nominated, old campaign wounds surely would be reopened. Over the years, Humphrey has accumulated some political liabilities, particularly in the field of campaign financing. Humphrey did nothing illegal, but some of the facts would be hard to explain in this post-Watergate era of American politics. Example, settlement of some big 1972 campaign debts at 4 cents on the dollar. Example, a 1968 campaign contribution from Gulf Oil of $25,000. Example, his 1970 campaign manager was convicted of accepting an illegal campaign contribution from a dairy industry association. Humphrey has been a friend of American farmers, especially dairy farmers, for many years. Last fall, he was featured guest at the National Milk Producers Federation Convention in New Orleans.
Now, I got in a little political trouble over some of you folks around here, as you know. You've read about that. All my life, I was worried about whiskey money, and I never knew my cracky I'd get caught up on milk money, but
This is a rare picture of Mr. Humphrey, listening.
Mr. Secretary,
Treasury Secretary Simon testifying before the Joint House and Senate Economic Committee, which Humphrey chairs and uses as a political forum.
Corn is $2.50 a bushel. Soybeans are $4 a bushel. Farm prices are lower right now than they were a year ago. And all this baloney about that agriculture is responsible for the price increase is a sheer bunch of barnyard stuff, and I just don't like it.
Humphrey is strong on civil rights, but lukewarm on busing. He is for government programs to fight unemployment. He is in favor of détente, in favor of Israel, in favor of federal aid to education. At 64, going on 65, Humphrey is in good health. He has recovered from X-ray treatment for a tumor of the bladder. He looks like a candidate. Tom Pettit, NBC News, Washington.
Muscular backache. When you say
Reagan's first campaign swing is over, and it was noteworthy for the trouble it got him into over a proposal to cut the federal budget by $90 billion. We have a report on the trip from Rick Davis, who traveled with Reagan.
It began on the ski slopes of New Hampshire, and Ronald Reagan's message remained the same as he moved through the snow and sun of 6 states. His theme, the federal government is too big. Power should be returned to the states.
He was never very enthused about looking at.
In his 2 swings through New Hampshire, Ronald Reagan has made over 60 appearances, sometimes before groups as small as a few people gathered at a roadside,
sometimes a few hundred at town halls and churches. In this and every state, the crowds pushed in on Reagan. His star appeal was obvious. But one issue haunted this campaign from the first day. It followed him from state to state. What did he mean by proposing to transfer a major share of federal health, education, and welfare programs to local control? Did he actually believe the federal budget could be cut by $90 billion, as he seemed to suggest in a Chicago speech last September? In Springfield, Illinois, he was asked if he had that specific figure or any figure in mind. The constant questions were beginning to irritate Reagan.
No, and no way in advance to have such a figure in mind. And this, again, is what I mean is a distortion of what I am trying to propose. And I'd like to know, does Ford have a better idea?
On a farm in Bloomington, Illinois, Reagan admitted the way he had made the proposal had been a mistake in style, that perhaps he had been misunderstood. He says he called for a gradual, systematic turnover of programs to the states. The issue received much media attention, but it seemed to have little effect on the people who came to see Ronald Reagan. That same night in Rockford, Illinois, the band played and people stood and shouted as Reagan took the stage. He would be brought back again and again, like an actor taking curtain calls. There were other times when the actor's image seemed to come alive in the campaign. The long goodbye kiss to his wife, Nancy, on the steps of the Capitol in Springfield, Illinois.
Maybe not tonight. Okay, all right.
And then the retake, a few minutes later, at an airfield. When the campaign headed south, the emphasis on patriotism and God grew. In Wilmington, North Carolina, he spoke of the return of the American POWs from Vietnam.
And down that ramp finally came that first man, now Rear Admiral Jeremiah Denton, over to that microphone, saluted the flag, and then thanked us and asked God's blessing on this country.
Before the elderly in Gulfport, Florida, Reagan talked about reforms in the Social Security system.
But any reform of that program must have as its first priority a guarantee that all of those who are counting on Social Security for their livelihood will continue to receive their monthly check, and that their benefits will not decline in purchasing power, but will keep pace with inflation.
He never outlined what specific changes should be made. But again, those who came to see and hear Reagan didn't seem to mind. This first campaign swing featured more style than substance. The criticism of Reagan's plan to transfer some federal programs to state and local control did upset him. If he was not scarred by it, he was at least bruised and forced to go on the defensive. This week, Reagan will be at his California ranch, getting himself and his programs in shape again. Rick Davis, NBC News.
Here are the first political returns for the year 1976. Yesterday, about 50,000 Democrats in Iowa met in caucuses in homes, churches, and firehouses to choose delegates for their state party convention. Most of them are still uncommitted, 37%. But former Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter did extremely well with 27% of the delegate preferences, more than twice as many as Indiana Senator Birch Bayh and 3 times as many as Fred Harris, the former Oklahoma senator. Others did less well. Congressman Morris Udall of Arizona got just under 6%. Sergeant Shriver just a little over 3%. Charles Quinn covered the Iowa caucuses for us, and here he is to tell us how they worked.
Carter, okay, how about in the back corner there? Is that all right? Harris, on the rest of this side over here.
At an Iowa precinct caucus, the name of the game is organization. The people who caucus are the party activists. The candidate who wins is the one who gets out the most troops. Successful strategy in a caucus state depends on intensive personal campaigning, not on mass voter appeal necessary in primary states. In a caucus like this one last night in a school in Des Moines, voters divided into small groups supporting various candidates. The regulars jockeyed and bargained among themselves in the struggle for precinct delegates.
Tell you how many we got. If Jackson and Harris, this Harris group, would go with Utah, this could knock down the uncommitted. That's what we don't want. We don't want to give the uncommitted strength.
No, we'll go. We would first go with the uncommitted.
What's the Humphrey vote?
We understand that. We understand that. I think we go with the Humphrey vote.
Forces in danger of losing out completely to stronger opponents often aligned themselves with the uncommitteds to keep their chances alive.
Uncommitted, come on, Jackson. Jackson, people, right in here.
So the uncommitteds included not only the genuinely undecided, but also voters favoring other candidates. Therefore, the significance of the uncommitted total is hard to measure. Democratic State Chairman Tom Whitney had this assessment of the Iowa caucus. Jimmy Carter, clearly the winner, scored well, came from nowhere. Birch Bayh did not do as well as expected. Udall campaigned in trouble, finished back in the pack. Shriver also finished way back in the pack. Harris, a moral victory, did better than predicted. The candidates were really not after delegates here in Iowa. What the candidates were after was a boost, some momentum to carry them into the primary battles ahead. And a big boost is exactly what Jimmy Carter got here. Charles Quinn, NBC News, Des Moines.
Carter was in New Hampshire today, grinning from ear to ear. While the Iowa caucuses were not important in terms of delegates, Iowa sends only 47 to the Democratic National Convention, and Carter won't get all of those. His victory yesterday was of great symbolic importance. There were those today who were using the words front runner to describe Carter. Judy Woodruff of our staff has his reaction to all of this.
Carter's supporters greeted him enthusiastically today in New Hampshire. Wearing his usual broad smile, Carter said he's tremendously encouraged by the Iowa result.
It's wonderful to see you, and congratulations in Iowa.
But Carter stressed that the results from one state aren't enough to say who is and who isn't a front runner.
It's just the first out of 50. But I think that among several candidates who might be equally acceptable to a voter, the fact that I'm able to win would be perhaps a deciding factor.
Carter will spend several days in New Hampshire this week aiming for the February 24th primary. Last night's victory came after months of campaigning and was no surprise to the Iowans who had worked with the Carter campaign. When Carter first visited Iowa 1 year ago, few people had even heard of him, much less thought about supporting him for president. But he quickly recruited people who were active in the Democratic Party and put together an organization, mostly of volunteers, that no other candidate was able to match. But most people agree that what helped Carter most was a warm style that catches on quickly with the voter.
He does a lot of the small things that people in Iowa who are very, very open appreciate, whether it's the personal note to them after having met them or the stopping at their house while driving from one community to another and attaching a note to a farmstead saying, just stopped to say hello, sorry that you weren't home. It has an impact and an impression upon people.
Political observers in Iowa said the fact that Carter is from the South was, in the minds of many Iowans, a handicap that had to be overcome. But his small town and farm background was a big help in this largely agricultural.
I'm prejudiced because you are a farmer, and I am a farmer.
That's the kind of prejudice I like. Well, I'm glad to meet you.
The results in Iowa help prove a point that's important to the Carter campaign. That is, that the former Georgia governor can win votes outside his native South. Judy Woodruff, NBC News.
There was also a small Republican Party straw poll in Iowa yesterday. President Ford got about 3% more support than Ronald Reagan, his challenger for the nomination. Aides of both men said today they were pleased at the outcome, but the experts said the results amounted to a dead heat.
Eat as you like. Take a good, healthy bite outside.
There's a new Gallup poll out today which shows President Ford doing better with Republicans across the country than his main challenger, Ronald Reagan. Ford leads Reagan in this new poll by 53% to 42%. The survey was made in the first week of January among Gallup's standard national sample of 1,500 people. Of those, 343 said they were Republicans, and that's the sample in this Reagan-Ford pairing, which means there's a margin of error of 6%. The White House, following a new practice, did not comment on the poll. ABC News poll conducted by telephone this week among over 2,000 adults across the country. The president's job rating is up 5 points since we polled in November, and the percentage of those disapproving is down 6 points. When we polled last month, Ford was losing to Reagan by 3 points. This week, the president has a sizable 12-point lead. On the Democratic side, not much change. Registered Democrats prefer Ted Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace in that order. But since we polled last month, Jimmy Carter's Democratic support has doubled. He's in 4th place. One reason for that increase in Carter's support is that he is not from Washington and says so all the time. We asked our respondents, would it be better if the next president had spent most of his political life outside of Washington? 46% said yes. 38% said a politician from Washington would do, and the large percentage, 16%, wasn't sure. And in view of today's House vote on banning aid to Angola, 47% of those polled believe we should support friendly countries, for example, Angola, to resist communist-backed forces. 40% said we shouldn't help in cases like that.